The moment he said fake Navy SEAL, he had no idea he'd just made the worst call of his career. The flashing red and blue lights cut across the quiet suburban street like a warning no one could ignore, reflecting off windshields, storefront glass, and the uneasy faces gathering along the sidewalk as Deputy Ryan Cole stepped out of his patrol car, his boots hitting the pavement with controlled authority, his jaw tight, his eyes already locked onto the man standing near a parked black SUV, a man who didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even raise his voice as the tension in the air thickened. With every second, because Marcus Hayes had seen this moment before, not this exact street, not this exact deputy, but the pattern, the look, the assumption that formed long before a word was spoken, and as Ryan approached, one hand resting near his belt, the other gesturing sharply, the message was clear long before he spoke. Step away from the vehicle and show me your ID. His tone firm, clipped, carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed without question, and yet Marcus didn't rush, didn't scramble. He moved slowly, deliberately, reaching into his jacket with a calm that didn't match the situation, pulling out a wallet, flipping it open just enough to reveal a card that Ryan barely glanced at before scoffing under his breath, a short, dismissive sound that carried more judgment than the words that followed. You expect me to believe this? Navy SEAL? He said, louder now. Enough for the small crowd forming behind the yellow line of curiosity to hear. Enough for a few phones to lift into the air, recording, waiting, because moments like this had a way of becoming something bigger, something heavier, and Marcus could feel it, the shift in the air, the weight of eyes, the quiet hum of people deciding what they thought they were seeing. And still, he said nothing, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, as if he were standing somewhere else entirely, somewhere far from the flicker of police lights and the low murmur of strangers. And that silence only seemed to irritate Ryan more, pushing him further into the role he had already decided to play. Turn around, he ordered, sharper this time. And when Marcus didn't immediately comply, just a fraction of a pause, just enough to be noticed, Ryan stepped closer, closing the distance, the authority in his stance hardening into something less patient, less willing to listen. And that was when Marcus finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, almost too calm for the moment. You might want to check that again, he said, not as a challenge, not as a threat, but as a fact, something simple, something easy to dismiss. And Ryan did exactly that, shaking his head with a short laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, I've heard that before, he replied, already reaching for the cuffs, the metallic click breaking through the quiet like a signal that the line had been crossed, that whatever this was about to become, it wasn't stopping here, and somewhere in the distance, far beyond the street, beyond the gathering crowd, beyond the assumptions already forming, a call had already been placed, a line already opened, a chain already set in motion, and none of them standing there, not Ryan, not the bystanders, not even the ones recording every second, understood that what had just started wasn't a simple arrest. It was a countdown, one that had already begun ticking the second Ryan decided he knew exactly who Marcus Hayes was, without ever really asking. The cold metal closed around Marcus Hayes's wrists with a sharp, unmistakable click, a sound that seemed to echo louder than it should in the still evening air, and for a brief moment, everything slowed, not because the world had stopped, but because every pair of eyes on that street had locked onto the same image, a calm man in handcuffs and a deputy who looked certain he had just done the right thing. And yet there was something in the way Marcus stood there, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, that did not match the scene unfolding around him, something that did not fit the narrative forming in the whispers of the crowd, because he was not resisting, not arguing, not even trying to explain himself again. And that silence carried a weight Ryan Cole did not fully understand, though he could feel it pressing against his confidence, testing it, quietly challenging it without a single raised voice. You are coming with me, Ryan said, his tone firm, almost louder than necessary, as if reinforcing the authority he believed was already unquestioned, and Marcus gave a small nod, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, a movement so subtle it could easily be misread. And as Ryan guided him toward the patrol car, the flashing lights painted shifting shadows across Marcus's face, shadows that revealed nothing, no panic, no anger, just a stillness that made one of the onlookers lower their phone for a second, uncertain of what they were actually witnessing, and somewhere behind them, a voice murmured, "He said he was a SEAL," followed by a quiet laugh that faded quickly, because even those watching could feel that something about this did not sit right. But Ryan did not hear that, or chose not to, because in his mind the situation had already been decided, already categorized, already filed under something familiar, something routine, and routine did not leave room for doubt. As he opened the back door of the cruiser and gestured for Marcus to step inside. "Last chance to tell me the truth," he added, leaning slightly closer, his voice dropping just enough to carry a hint of warning. And for the first time, Marcus looked directly at him, not past him, not through him, but at him, his eyes steady, almost measured, as if weighing something unseen. "I already did," he replied, calm and even, and that was it. No elaboration, no attempt to convince, just a statement left hanging in the air like a line drawn in a place Ryan could not yet see. And that line unsettled him more than he expected, though he would never admit it, not to himself, not to anyone, because admitting uncertainty meant losing control, and control was the one thing he refused to give up, especially not here, not in front of a growing crowd, not in front of a situation he believed he had already handled. And so he shut the door, the solid thud cutting off whatever silence remained between them, sealing Marcus inside as the red and blue lights continued their relentless rhythm. And for a few seconds, Ryan just stood there, staring at the reflection of his own uniform in the tinted glass, his expression firm, unyielding, until a faint crackle came through his radio, a voice on the other end asking for confirmation. Routine communication, nothing unusual, nothing urgent, and yet as Ryan reached for it, something in the tone made him pause, just for a fraction of a second, long enough for doubt to slip in before he pushed it back out, pressing the button and responding with the same confidence he had carried from the start. "Suspect is in custody," he said, each word deliberate, final, as if speaking it out loud made it unquestionably true. But inside the patrol car, Marcus Hayes leaned back slightly, his eyes closing for just a moment, not in defeat, not in frustration, but in quiet awareness, because he could hear it too, not the words on the radio, but the shift beneath them, the subtle change in rhythm that most people would miss. And when he opened his eyes again, there was something different there, something that suggested he was not waiting to be taken anywhere, but waiting for something to arrive, something already moving toward them, something Ryan Cole had no idea was already on its way. The radio in Deputy Ryan Cole's hand crackled again, but this time the tone was different, sharper, cutting through the air with a precision that made him instinctively straighten his posture as the voice on the other end spoke more urgently than before, asking for his badge number, repeating his location twice, as if confirming something far beyond a routine stop. And for the first time since the moment he stepped out of his patrol car, Ryan felt a flicker of hesitation, small but unmistakable, as he responded with controlled professionalism, his words measured, his tone steady, yet his grip on the radio tightened just slightly, enough to reveal what he was beginning to feel beneath the surface, because this was no longer following the familiar script he had relied on countless times before. And as he ended the transmission, a silence settled over him, not the quiet of the street, but something internal, something that made him glance back toward the cruiser where Marcus Hayes sat, behind the glass, calm, unmoving, as if none of this was unexpected, as if he had already heard what Ryan was only beginning to sense. And that realization pressed against Ryan's confidence in a way he could not easily ignore. Yet he pushed forward, stepping toward the driver's side door, telling himself this was still under control, still within his authority, still something he could manage. But before he could open the door, another sound broke through the night, distant at first, low and steady, the unmistakable hum of approaching engines that did not belong to the usual rhythm of the town. And the crowd noticed it too, heads turning almost in unison toward the far end of the street where headlights appeared, not one set, but several, moving with purpose, their approach deliberate, coordinated. And for a brief moment, no one spoke, because something about it felt different, heavier, as if the situation had quietly shifted without warning. And Ryan stood there, watching, his expression tightening as the vehicles drew closer, dark, unmarked, their presence alone enough to silence the murmurs that had filled the air just moments before. And when the first one came to a stop, its engine cutting off with a finality that echoed louder than expected, a door opened, and a man stepped out, dressed not in a local uniform, but in something far more formal, his posture straight, his gaze scanning the scene with a level of authority that did not need to be announced, and behind him, others followed, their movements precise, controlled, each step carrying the weight of purpose, and Ryan felt it then, unmistakably, the shift in control he had not anticipated, the subtle but undeniable realization that whatever was happening was no longer centered around him. And as the lead figure approached, stopping just a few feet away, his eyes moved briefly to the cruiser, then back to Ryan, and in that moment, the entire street seemed to hold its breath, because there was no confusion in that look, no uncertainty, only clarity. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm, every word deliberate. "Deputy Cole," he said, not asking, but confirming, and Ryan nodded almost automatically, his response coming slower than usual. "Yes, sir." And the man's gaze did not waver as he continued. "We need you to step away from the vehicle." And it was not a request, not phrased as one, not delivered with any room for interpretation. And that was the moment it landed fully, not as a thought, but as a realization that settled heavily in Ryan's chest, because authority recognizes authority. And this was something beyond his reach, beyond his control. And as he took a step back, almost without thinking, his eyes shifted once more to the back seat of his cruiser, where Marcus Hayes remained exactly as he had been, composed, silent, watching through the glass as if he had been waiting for this exact moment all along. And somewhere deep in Ryan's mind, a single thought began to form, quiet but impossible to ignore, that maybe this was never about proving who Marcus Hayes was, but about revealing something far more uncomfortable, something that had already begun the second Ryan decided he did not need to listen. Ryan Cole did not move immediately, and that hesitation, brief as it was, did not go unnoticed by the man standing in front of him, whose presence alone seemed to quiet the entire street in a way no flashing lights ever could. And for a moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the patrol car engine and the distant hum of traffic far beyond the scene, as if the world outside had chosen to keep its distance from whatever was unfolding here. "Step away from the vehicle, deputy," the man repeated, his voice steady, not louder, not more forceful, but carrying a weight that made it impossible to ignore. And this time Ryan complied, taking another step back, then another, creating space between himself and the cruiser as his eyes flicked briefly toward the small crowd, noticing how the phones were still raised, how the whispers had stopped, replaced by a kind of silence that felt expectant, as if everyone sensed that the moment they were witnessing had shifted into something far more serious than it had appeared just minutes ago. And as Ryan lowered his hand from his radio, the man turned slightly, giving a subtle nod to one of the others who had arrived with him, and, without a word, that individual moved toward the back of the patrol car, his movements controlled, deliberate, opening the door with a calm efficiency that stood in sharp contrast to the tension that had filled the air earlier. And for the first time since the cuffs had closed, Marcus Hayes stepped out, not rushed, not hurried, but with the same quiet composure he had maintained from the beginning, his posture straight, his expression unchanged, as if this moment had always been inevitable. And as he stood there, the red and blue lights casting shifting colors across his face, the man who had addressed Ryan took a step closer, his gaze now fixed entirely on Marcus. And there was something in that look, something that carried recognition, respect, and confirmation all at once. And when he spoke, his tone softened just slightly, not in weakness, but in acknowledgement. "Sir," he said, a single word that seemed to ripple through the crowd, because titles like that were not given lightly. Not in situations like this, and certainly not to someone who had just been sitting in the back of a patrol car. And Ryan felt it then, not just the shift, but the full weight of it, pressing down on everything he had assumed, everything he had decided before asking the right questions, before taking the time to understand who he was dealing with. And his eyes moved from the man in front of him back to Marcus, searching for something, an explanation, a sign that this was not what it looked like. But Marcus did not offer one. He simply stood there, calm, steady, as if the truth did not need to be explained because it had already arrived on its own. And the man turned back to Ryan, his expression now firm once again. "Do you have any idea who this is?" he asked, not aggressively, not accusingly, but with a clarity that made the question feel heavier than any raised voice ever could. And Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but the words did not come immediately, because for the first time, he was no longer certain of the answer, and that uncertainty lingered just long enough to say everything it needed to say, and the man did not wait for him to find the words. "This situation is no longer under your jurisdiction," he continued, each word precise, leaving no room for interpretation, and behind him, one of the vehicles had its door open, revealing a glimpse of equipment, of structure, of something organized and far-reaching, something that did not operate on assumptions or quick judgments. And as the realization settled deeper, Ryan felt the weight of every decision he had made in the last 10 minutes, each one now leading to this moment, this confrontation, this quiet unraveling of control. And yet the most striking part was not the authority in front of him, not the presence of those who had arrived, but the silence of Marcus Hayes, a silence that had never been about fear, never been about submission, but about certainty, the kind of certainty that does not need to prove itself, because it knows that, eventually, the truth will arrive on its own, and when it does not ask for permission, it simply takes its place. Ryan Cole felt the question hang in the air longer than it should have, stretching the silence into something almost unbearable as every second passed without an answer. And in that silence, the confidence he had carried just minutes ago began to unravel, not all at once, but slowly, piece by piece, as the reality of the situation settled in around him, heavier with every breath. And when he finally spoke, his voice lacked the sharp certainty it once held. He said he was a Navy SEAL, he replied, the words sounding weaker now, more like an explanation than a statement, and the man in front of him did not react immediately, did not raise his voice or show anger, but instead gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if confirming something he had already known before stepping onto that street. "He is," the man said simply, and those two words landed with more force than anything else that had been said so far, because they did not argue, they did not debate, they did not justify. They confirmed, and confirmation, in that moment, carried far more weight than accusation ever could, and Ryan's gaze shifted again to Marcus Hayes, seeing him now not as a suspect, not as a question, but as something he had failed to recognize when it mattered most. And Marcus met that look without hostility, without triumph, just the same calm presence he had maintained from the beginning, a presence that now felt different, not because it had changed, but because Ryan was finally seeing it clearly for what it was. And the man turned slightly, addressing the others who had arrived with him in low, controlled tones, words that were not meant for the crowd, words that carried structure and purpose, and one of them stepped forward with a small device in hand, speaking quietly into it, relaying information that moved beyond the boundaries of the street, beyond the authority of a single deputy. And as that exchange continued, Ryan stood there, aware now of the distance that had formed between him and the situation, a distance he could not close simply by asserting control, because control was no longer his to claim. And the realization pressed against him with a quiet intensity, not loud, not explosive, but steady, undeniable. And in that moment, the flashing lights behind him felt less like a symbol of authority and more like a reminder of how quickly perception could shift, how easily certainty could dissolve when faced with truth. And the man stepped closer once more, his attention returning fully to Ryan. "There are protocols," he said, his tone measured, not accusatory, but firm. "And there are reasons those protocols exist." And though the words were simple, they carried an implication Ryan could not ignore. One that pointed not just to what had happened, but to how it had happened, to the assumptions that had shaped his decisions before he had all the information, before he had taken the time to verify, to understand, to question his own certainty. And Ryan swallowed, his throat suddenly dry, as the weight of that implication settled deeper, because this was no longer about a single moment, a single decision. It was about a pattern, a way of seeing, a way of acting that had led him here without hesitation, without doubt, until now. And behind them, the crowd remained silent, watching, recording, bearing witness to a moment that had transformed without warning, a moment that had begun as something routine and had become something far more revealing. And Marcus Hayes finally spoke again, his voice calm, steady, cutting through the quiet without effort. "You did what you thought was right," he said, not as an accusation, not as forgiveness, but as a statement of fact. And Ryan looked at him, searching for something in those words, a hint of judgment, a sign of anger, but found none, only clarity. And that clarity made it harder to look away, because it did not offer him an easy escape, did not soften what had happened. It simply acknowledged it, leaving him to face the truth of it on his own. And as the man beside Marcus gave a final nod to his team, signaling that everything was now in motion, that the situation had been fully transferred, Ryan understood something he had not considered before, that this moment was not just about who Marcus Hayes was, but about what had been revealed in the process of misunderstanding him, something deeper than a mistake, something that could not be undone by a simple correction. Because some lessons do not arrive with noise or force, they arrive quietly, in the space where certainty once lived, and once they are there, they do not leave. The air did not return to normal after that moment. It shifted into something heavier, something that lingered even as the flashing lights continued to rotate, and the crowd remained frozen in quiet observation, because what had just unfolded was not loud, not chaotic, but it carried a clarity that no one there could ignore. And as the unmarked vehicles idled in place, their presence now fully established, one of the officials stepped forward with a small folder in hand, opening it with a calm precision that suggested this situation had already been anticipated long before it reached this street. And Ryan Cole watched as documents were briefly reviewed, names confirmed, details aligned with a system far beyond his reach, and each small motion seemed to reinforce the same reality he was only beginning to accept, that this was never a misunderstanding that could be easily corrected, but part of something larger that had been set in motion without his awareness. And as the official closed the folder, he looked once more at Marcus Hayes, giving a subtle nod that carried both acknowledgement and confirmation, as if to say that everything was now exactly where it needed to be. And Marcus responded with the slightest inclination of his head, not as someone being validated, but as someone who had expected nothing less. And that quiet exchange spoke louder than any explanation could have, because it revealed a level of trust, of coordination, of purpose that had been completely invisible just minutes ago. And Ryan stood at the edge of it all, no longer at the center, no longer directing the outcome, but observing the consequences of a decision he had made too quickly, too confidently, without fully understanding the situation in front of him. And for the first time, he allowed himself to replay those moments. The initial approach, the assumption, the dismissal of the identification, the certainty that had guided every step, and now, standing in the aftermath of that certainty, he could see the gaps, the places where he had chosen speed over verification, assumption over understanding, and those realizations did not arrive with noise or confrontation. They settled quietly, pressing against him with a weight that could not be ignored. And as the officials began to reposition, preparing to leave as efficiently as they had arrived, one of them paused near Ryan, his expression not harsh, not condemning, but firm in a way that required no further explanation. "This is why we check," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying the kind of authority that came from experience rather than rank. And then he moved on, leaving Ryan with those words and everything they implied. And behind him, Marcus Hayes took a step forward, no longer confined, no longer questioned, but still carrying the same composure that had defined him from the beginning. And for a brief moment, their paths aligned again, their eyes meeting in a silence that held more meaning now than it had before. And Ryan felt the weight of that moment, not because of what was said, but because of what was understood. And Marcus did not speak immediately, did not rush to fill the silence. He simply looked at Ryan, with a calm that was neither distant nor confrontational, just present. And when he finally spoke, his voice remained even, controlled, as if nothing about the situation required him to raise it. "You saw what you expected to see," he said, and there was no anger in those words, only truth. And that truth settled deeper than any accusation could have, because it did not attack, it revealed. And Ryan did not respond right away, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that Anything he said now would not change what had already been exposed, not just the mistake, but the mindset behind it. And as the unmarked vehicles began to pull away one by one, their departure as quiet and controlled as their arrival, the street slowly returned to its normal rhythm, the crowd dispersing, the phones lowering, the murmurs returning in softer tones. But for Ryan, nothing felt the same. Because the moment had already done its work, it had already shifted something fundamental. Something that would not simply reset when the lights turned off. And as he stood there, alone beside his patrol car, the fading reflections of red and blue lights stretching across the pavement, he realized that authority was not just about acting. It was about understanding when to pause, when to question, when to look beyond the surface before making a decision. And that realization, quiet as it was, carried a weight that would stay with him long after the street returned to silence. The last of the unmarked vehicles disappeared down the street, their presence fading into the distance as if they had never been there at all, leaving behind nothing but the quiet echo of what had just unfolded. And for a moment, the street seemed almost unchanged, the same pavement, the same streetlights, the same evening air settling back into place. But for those who had witnessed it, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and Deputy Ryan Cole remained standing beside his patrol car, his posture no longer rigid with authority but held in a stillness that suggested something deeper, something unsettled, as the flashing lights finally dimmed and then went dark, removing the last visible symbol of control he had relied on just minutes before. And without those lights, the scene looked different, less defined, more real, as if the truth of what had happened was now fully exposed without the distraction of urgency. And across from him, Marcus Hayes stood near the black SUV, speaking quietly with one of the officials who had stayed behind just long enough to ensure everything was concluded properly. Their conversation brief, efficient, carrying the tone of people who understood each other without needing many words. And when it ended, Marcus turned slightly, his attention returning to Ryan once more, not because he had to, but because there was something unfinished in the space between them, something that had not been spoken yet, but was understood by both. And as Marcus took a few steps forward, closing that distance, Ryan felt the weight of that approach, not as a threat, not as confrontation, but as a moment he could not avoid, a moment that required him to face what had happened without the shield of authority, without the comfort of assumption. And when Marcus stopped a few feet away, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with everything that had led to this point, every decision, every word, every missed opportunity to pause and look deeper. And Ryan shifted slightly, his eyes meeting Marcus's again, and this time there was no confusion in that gaze, no uncertainty about who he was looking at, only the recognition of someone he had misjudged from the very beginning. And that recognition carried its own kind of weight, heavier than any formal consequence, because it could not be dismissed or corrected with a simple explanation. And Marcus studied him for a moment, not searching for weakness, not looking for an apology, but observing, as if measuring what had changed and what had not. And when he spoke, his voice remained steady, calm, the same tone he had used from the start. "There was a moment back there," he said, his words deliberate, "when you could have asked one more question." And Ryan felt that sentence land with quiet precision, because it pointed directly to the exact place where everything could have been different, where one choice, one pause, one question could have changed the entire course of what followed. And he nodded slightly, not out of agreement alone, but out of understanding, because he could see it now, clearly, the path he had taken and the one he had ignored. And for a second, he considered responding, offering something in return, but the words felt insufficient, too small to match the clarity of what had been revealed. And Marcus did not wait for an answer. He simply continued. "Authority is not just about acting first," he added, his gaze unwavering. "It is about knowing when not to." And those words settled into the silence between them, carrying a truth that extended far beyond this single moment, beyond this street, beyond this encounter. And Ryan exhaled slowly, the tension he had carried finally shifting into something else, something quieter, more reflective. As he looked down briefly and then back up, meeting Marcus's eyes again, not as an officer asserting control, but as a man acknowledging what he had failed to see. And in that exchange, something changed, not outwardly, not in a way the crowd could capture or understand, but internally, where the real impact of the moment took hold. And Marcus gave a small nod, not of approval, not of dismissal, but of closure, as if the conversation had reached exactly where it needed to go, and without another word, he turned and walked back toward his vehicle, his steps steady, unhurried, leaving Ryan standing there with nothing but the fading sound of footsteps and the realization that some lessons do not come from what happens to you, but from what you fail to see until it is too late. Marcus Hayes opened the driver's door of the black SUV with a quiet, deliberate motion, the soft click of the handle sounding almost louder now that the street had returned to stillness. And for a moment, he paused before getting in, his hand resting lightly against the door, as if acknowledging the weight of what had just happened without needing to revisit it. And then he stepped inside, the interior light flickering briefly before fading, leaving only the outline of his silhouette visible through the tinted glass. And as the engine started, smooth and controlled, the vehicle pulled away from the curb without urgency, without drama, merging into the flow of the road as if it had always belonged there. And within seconds, it was gone, its presence reduced to nothing more than a memory held by those who had witnessed the moment unfold. And Ryan Cole stood where he was, watching the empty space it left behind, his mind replaying everything with a clarity that had not been there before, each detail sharper now, each decision more defined, as if distance had given him the perspective he had lacked in the moment, and the street around him slowly resumed its rhythm, the last few bystanders drifting away, their quiet conversations carrying fragments of disbelief, of realization, of something they would likely recount later in their own words, each version shaped by what they thought they had seen. But Ryan knew the truth of it was not something that could be easily explained or simplified, because it was not just about a mistaken arrest. It was about something deeper, something that had revealed itself in the space between assumption and reality. And as he reached up to turn off his body camera, his hand paused for a fraction of a second, the weight of that small action settling in, because this moment, recorded and preserved, would not simply disappear when the night ended. It would follow him, in reports, in reviews, in questions that would come later, questions he would now have to answer not just with facts, but with understanding. And as he finally pressed the button, the quiet click marked the end of one moment and the beginning of something else, something less visible but far more significant. And he exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing just enough to allow him to think clearly, to process what had changed. And as he looked down the street one last time, the empty road reflecting the faint glow of distant streetlights, he realized that what had happened here would not be measured by how quickly it was resolved, but by what it had revealed in the process. And that realization did not come with comfort. It came with responsibility, the kind that does not fade with time but stays, shaping the way decisions are made long after the moment itself has passed. And he turned back toward his patrol car, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if each step carried a new awareness, a quiet shift in the way he saw the role he had once approached with unquestioned certainty. And as he opened the door and sat inside, the familiar interior felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had, even if only slightly, even if in a way that would take time to fully understand. And as the engine started and the radio came back to life with routine chatter, Ryan listened differently, hearing not just instructions, but the space between them, the pauses where questions could be asked, where assumptions could be checked, where certainty could be challenged before it turned into something irreversible. And as he pulled away from the curb, the tires rolling forward into the quiet night, he carried that awareness with him, not as a burden, but as something sharper, something clearer, a reminder that authority, when left unquestioned, can easily become something else, and that the difference between the two often comes down to a single moment, a single choice, a single question that is either asked or ignored. And as the street disappeared behind him, the lesson remained, steady and unyielding, long after everything else had faded. The road stretched ahead in long, quiet lines as Deputy Ryan Cole drove through the dim glow of streetlights, each passing block reflecting faintly across his windshield like a repeating reminder of the night he could not leave behind. And though the radio continued its steady stream of routine updates, he found himself listening without truly hearing, his focus drifting back to the same moment over and over again. The moment when certainty had replaced curiosity, when assumption had overridden judgment. And as the patrol car moved at a steady 35 miles per hour through the sleeping town, Ryan realized that what unsettled him most was not the outcome, not the presence of higher authority stepping in, but how easily he had reached that decision in the first place, how natural it had felt to act without asking one more question. And that realization stayed with him long after the street had disappeared from view, because it was not tied to a single incident. It pointed to something deeper, something ingrained, something that had guided him without resistance until now. And he tightened his grip slightly on the steering wheel, not out of tension, but out of awareness, as if grounding himself in the present while his thoughts traced back through the past, examining patterns he had never stopped to question before. And somewhere in that reflection, the image of Marcus Hayes remained clear, not as a figure of authority, not as a symbol of power, but as a presence defined by control, by patience, by a kind of certainty that did not rely on proving itself. And that contrast lingered, shaping the way Ryan now understood what he had witnessed, because true authority, he realized, did not rush, did not assume, did not need to assert itself loudly to be real. And as he turned onto a quieter road, the town falling further into silence, the meaning of that distinction settled deeper, becoming less of a thought and more of a truth he could not ignore. And hours later, when he finally parked the patrol car and sat in the stillness of the engine winding down, the absence of noise felt heavier than the chaos that had come before, because now there was nothing left to distract him from the clarity of what had been revealed. And he leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, allowing that clarity to settle fully, not resisting it, not dismissing it, but accepting it for what it was, a turning point, subtle but undeniable. And in that quiet moment, the lesson of the night took shape in a way that did not need to be written or spoken aloud, because it had already been etched into his understanding, that authority without reflection is fragile, that judgment without question is incomplete, and that the difference between control and truth often comes down to a single choice made in a single moment. And somewhere miles away, Marcus